Hi everyone, my name is Jia Yi and I'll be presenting our paper titled Causal Structure Learning of Bias for Fair Affect Recognition. The motivation of this piece of work is the problem of bias. As many of you know, the problem of bias and fairness is becoming increasingly prevalent. A seminal and well-known paper here highlights the stark discrepancy that shows that darker-skinned females get a much higher error rate across all major facial recognition frameworks. This problem of bias is compounded by the fact that the machine learning algorithms are often black box in nature. As such, it makes it difficult to understand the source of bias and debias the outputs as a result. Causal reasoning has been proposed as a tool to better understand these black box systems. In addition, no existing literature has formalized the different type of bias in terms of causal graphs. As such, our contribution is as follows. First, we provide the first formalization of the prevalent types of bias in affect recognition using causal graphs. Second, we provide a proof of concept of a post hoc pattern search method that can be used to understand bias. Third, we provide an analysis of our findings and highlight existing opportunities as well as challenges. So the first contribution here involves formulating bias in affect recognition causally. Here in Figure 1, we have an overall causal structure of a typical affect dataset. First, note that the black nodes and arrows correspond to the observed variables and observable functions. The gray nodes correspond to the unobservable variables and function, and we use the letter X to denote the image, R to denote the image representation learned by the machine learning model, Y to denote the ground truth labels, LY to denote the class labels labeled by the annotator, A is used to denote the ground truth sensitive attributes such as race, gender, and age. Z is used to denote the contextual factors or background noise, and I is used as the image feature which should be directly relevant towards the predicting of the true class label Y. First, we tackle the first bias that we have in this formulation. This would be the dataset bias as represented by the node, the red node here indicated in the slide. In general, a dataset is deemed to be unbiased if the joint distribution between the model or the training distribution matches that of reality or of the testing distribution. So the gap between the two distributions may largely be deemed to be a domain shift problem. As a result, most debiasing techniques for image or facial affect recognition focus on the bias from the image data X. So this can be understood as the bias that arises from the images themselves. This form of bias is illustrated here in Figure 2 as represented by the red node as mentioned previously. Intuitively, this would mean that the distribution parameters, for instance, the means, the standard deviation, and the skews, etc., that characterizes the population differ across the demographic subgroups. Here, we define subgroups as subsets of the population defined across certain sensitive attributes such as race, age, and gender. Looking at the figure that we have here, if we only have information about the statistical distribution of the parameters, dataset bias in the form of distribution mismatch does not tell us much, as we would not know whether the source of bias is A, Z, or I. Labeling or annotation bias can be understood as the bias stemming from the labeling process. So labeling bias is a form of bias more prevalent or observed in affect recognition. This is due to the subjective nature of facial affect expression and recognition. For instance, in a conventional computer vision setup, there is typically no or minimal discrepancy between LY and Y as they are typically the same. For example, assuming an object detection task where the object in question is a car, compared to an affect recognition task, the discrepancy between Y and LY will be lesser in most cases, as we can usually collectively and objectively agree on whether the object is in fact a car or not. However, this is more challenging for affect recognition. So first, there is the discrepancy between self-reported, third-party, and machine or algorithm-labeled annotations. Existing research on affect recognition has indicated that, depending on the way affect is labeled, whether is it intended, self-reported, or observed, the outcome or accuracy of an algorithm can differ widely. In addition, there is another layer of bias introduced by the individual labelers. Taking third-party annotation as an example, across gender, it has been noted that third-party observers are likelier to perceive female faces as happier than males. Across race, there is the problem of the other race effect, where this effect corresponds to the phenomena where individuals are often better at recognizing people of their own race than they are of the other race. Intuitively, this form of bias is evidenced by the graph here in figure 3. There is bias if Ly differs substantially from Y. There is no or minimal bias if Ly aligns with Y. We can identify and mitigate this if we have lab-collected data where the ground truth Y is provided by the actual subjects. However, for images collected in the wild, we typically only have access to Ly but not Y. The next type of bias that we would examine is that of contextual bias. Here, we use the term contextual bias as the overall background environment, for instance, the image backdrop or contextual scene that an image is placed in. This is a pernicious cause of disparity in algorithm performance and is widely investigated as an out-of-distribution generalization problem in computer vision. For the specific computer vision problem of facial affect recognition, the biggest dichotomy is between that of a lab-controlled and an in-the-wild dataset. Other sources of contextual bias include pose, lighting, outdoor versus indoor, camera, equipment, etc. This is a non-trivial form of bias. For instance, research has shown that the image quality explains some, but not all, of the variation in algorithm performance across race. The findings indicated that when ICAO compliant, i.e. better quality images were used, accuracy actually improved across board. Next, we will provide further details about our experimental setup. First, we chiefly conducted our experiments on the RAFDB dataset. RAFDB contains labels in terms of facial expressions of emotions, including surprise, fear, disgust, happy, anger, sad, and neutral, and sensitive attribute labels along gender, race, as well as age. We excluded images labeled as unsure for gender. In addition, the age binning system is likely to cause greater variation noise. For instance, an individual who is age 4 is likely to look very different from someone who is age 19, but yet they are categorized in the same category. As such, we have chosen to restrict our analysis to the sensitive attributes, gender, and race. We utilize a subset of the dataset consisting of 14,388 images with 11,512 samples used for training and 2,876 samples used for testing within our experiments. This training and testing split has been predefined according to the instructions in the original dataset. So, our research employs a two-step process. First, we train a basic black box prediction model, a ResNet 18, on the raw images to predict the emotion class of each image. Subsequently, we run the fast causal inference algorithm to learn the causal structure between the variables, predicted labels, and actual labeled emotions. So here are some further details about the implementation. So ResNet 18 was implemented using a PyTorch implementation and trained from scratch with an Adam optimizer within a mini batch with a mini batch of size 64 a learning rate of 0.001, which decays linearly by a factor of 0.1 for every 40 epochs. We apply early stopping if necessary. Early stopping is applied if accuracy does not increase after 30 epochs. All the images were pre-processed by cropping to ensure faces appear in approximately similar positions. They were also normalized to 128 times 128 pixels. And we also perform data augmentation by randomly cropping and rotating the images. The fast causal inference algorithm, on the other hand, consists of two main phases. First, the adjacency phase of the algorithm starts with a completely undirected graph. Next, we have the orientation phase, where we use the stored conditioning set that previously led to the removal of adjacencies to orient as many of the edges as possible. Further details or the pseudocode for this fast causal inference can be found in the book Causation, Prediction, and Search, as noted at the bottom of the slide. Next, we move on to some of the results that we have from these experiments. First, we analyze the causal structure learned when we do not include the black box predictions within the ecosystem. So, we see from the graph on the left, the causal structure which is learned when we do not supplant prior knowledge. The graph on the right here indicates the causal structure learned after supplanting prior knowledge. Prior or background knowledge can be understood as a pre-imposed set of conditions where certain variables cannot or must cause others. The constraints can also be different variables that are in different time orders and thus cannot be the cause of one another. As we can see, the SCI algorithm ran without supplanting prior knowledge is not able to learn any meaningful causal effects. The causal structure learned after supplanting prior knowledge is slightly better, but this is chiefly due to us providing extra information to the algorithm. In our second experiment, we repeated the same experiment but with the predicted emotion class from the ResNet 18 included as part of the ecosystem. Again, here we see the graph on the left is the causal structure learned without supplanting prior knowledge, and the graph on the right is the causal structure learned after supplanting prior knowledge. We see that this produced more informative results than before. Analyzing the graph on the left, we see that there is unmeasured confounding between the variables age and gender, and between the variables gender and emotion labels. Interestingly, we see a green arrow from age to emotion label and from emotion label to emotion predictions. If an edge is green, the relationship is most likely direct. The interpretation here is that age is certainly a direct cause of emotion label, and emotion label is certainly a direct cause of emotion predictions. The table here summarizes the different arrow interpretations. The results suggest that there might be some form of labeling bias across the sensitive attributes gender and age, since we have the third type of arrow between age and emotion label as well as gender and emotion label. This means that across both age and gender, they might either be a cause of emotion label or that there is unmeasured confounding between them. Indeed, across gender, we see a wider disparity between the emotion class breakdown and that of the subgroup breakdown. For instance, there is disproportionately more females categorized as happy and disproportionately more males categorized as angry. In sum, despite the inherent limitations of causal structure learning, we are still able to gain some post-hoc understanding of the bias present. Results indicated that the source of bias can either be one or both of the following: dataset bias, where there is more male samples for the emotion angry, or labeling bias, where the labeling process acts as a confounding factor for both the label-sensitive attribute and labeled emotion class. The limitation of this piece of work is that there is insufficient evidence to scientifically explain each source of bias. In addition, there is currently no affect-based dataset that is balanced across classes, which makes it difficult for us to rerun the same analysis across a class-balanced dataset. Finally, I would like to acknowledge my fellow collaborators for assisting with this piece of work, as well as the various funding agency that has supported our research. Thank you all for listening and feel free to ask any questions.